Why did the end of Oak Street change its original ending? Warning: major spoilers. The ending of the end of Oak Street was changed very late in production. Originally, Greg Platt was supposed to die permanently, and Denise and the children were not going to return to 1982. Instead, the final movie gives the family a much more hopeful ending, with Denise using the wormhole to return to the past and save Greg. And Hathaway initially questioned the change, but later said an emotional audience reaction convinced her that the new ending was the right choice. So, why did the end of Oak Street change its original ending? The answer is surprisingly simple. The filmmakers originally planned to end the movie on a much darker and more ambiguous note. Greg was supposed to die and stay dead. There was no last-minute rescue, no family reunion, no second chance. Instead, Denise and her children would travel through the wormhole, but they would fail to return to their own time. That ending was ultimately replaced because director David Robert Mitchell and producer J.J. Abrams decided that the movie needed something more hopeful and emotionally satisfying. But the change wasn't just about making audiences happy. It fundamentally changed what the movie was saying about grief, family, and second chances. What happened in the original ending? To understand why the ending was changed, we first need to understand what the filmmakers originally planned. In the finished movie, Greg dies while protecting Denise from an Allosaurus. It's a shocking moment because Greg is one of the film's main characters, and his death happens much earlier than audiences might expect. After Greg's death, Denise, Audrey, Brian, and Jeanette eventually discover a wormhole. They use it to travel backward through time. In the theatrical version, they return to 1982, shortly before the original disaster occurs. Denise realizes that she can change what happened. She warns people to leave Oak Street. And most importantly, she realizes Greg is still alive. She finds him delivering pizzas and manages to reunite the family. That's the ending we see. But that wasn't the original plan. The original ending was much darker. According to Ewan McGregor, the original ending took the family in a completely different direction. Denise and the children still entered the wormhole. But instead of returning to 1982, they traveled too far back. They ended up in a much earlier period during the era of European settlers. In other words, they escaped the dinosaurs, but they didn't actually make it home. They were stranded in the distant past. And Greg was still dead. That would have meant the movie ended with Denise and her children surviving the immediate threat, but losing their husband and father permanently. It's a very different emotional conclusion. Instead of, "We lost Greg, but we found a way to save him," the original version would have been, "We survived, but Greg is gone, and we're trapped in another unfamiliar world." McGregor described the original concept as Denise and the children ending up in the settlers' era rather than their own time. Why was Greg's death so important? Greg's death was never supposed to be a random shock. It was designed to have emotional consequences for Denise. At the beginning of the movie, Denise and Greg's marriage is falling apart. They have become disconnected from each other. Denise is thinking about leaving. Greg has lost his job and isn't communicating honestly with his family. They're essentially living together, without really being connected. Then the dinosaur disaster changes everything. Suddenly, survival becomes more important than their marital problems. Greg ultimately sacrifices himself to protect Denise. His death forces Denise to confront what she actually feels about him. She realizes that the person she was preparing to leave is also the person she's desperate not to lose. That's why bringing Greg back changes the emotional meaning of the entire movie. Why did Mitchell and Abrams change it? The exact reasoning wasn't presented as one single dramatic decision. And Hathaway has explained that the script went through several changes before filming, and the ending was one of the biggest. She said Greg always died in the script, but when she originally signed on, he didn't return after his death. The change happened very close to the beginning of production. Hathaway initially wasn't convinced. She had become emotionally invested in the darker version. She essentially trusted Mitchell and Abrams to know what they were doing, even though she wasn't sure the new ending would work. And that's important. The filmmakers weren't simply changing a few lines. They were changing the emotional destination of the entire story. And Hathaway initially had doubts. Hathaway's reaction is particularly interesting because she had already built her performance around the original ending. She knew Denise was going to lose Greg. She understood the story as a tragedy. So when the filmmakers decided to bring him back, she wasn't immediately convinced. She reportedly had to trust Mitchell and Abrams that the new version would be better. That uncertainty makes sense. Greg's death is filmed as a genuine sacrifice. It's violent, it's emotional, and it feels final. If you're going to bring that character back later, there's always a risk that the earlier emotional impact will be weakened. That's exactly what Hathaway was concerned about. What changed her mind? Interestingly, Hathaway's opinion changed after she actually watched the finished movie with another person. That person had lost their father. When the ending arrived and Greg returned, the viewer became extremely emotional and cried. Hathaway realized that the reunion had touched something very personal. The person reportedly told her that this was exactly the kind of ending they wanted from a movie, an impossible second chance that could only happen in a story like this. That experience convinced Hathaway that Mitchell and Abrams had made the right decision. And it explains why the final ending feels so different from the rest of the movie. Why does the new ending work emotionally? The new ending turns the end of Oak Street into a story about second chances. Denise begins the movie questioning her marriage. She isn't sure whether she wants to stay with Greg. Then the world literally falls apart around her. Dinosaurs appear. Her neighborhood is ripped out of its normal reality. Her family is forced to fight for survival. And Greg eventually dies protecting them. Only after losing him does Denise fully understand what he means to her. So when she gets the impossible opportunity to go back, she makes a different choice. She saves him. That gives the entire dinosaur adventure an emotional purpose. Without the revised ending, Greg's death would simply reinforce the movie's darker themes. With it, his death becomes the event that motivates Denise to change her life. Does the new ending make the movie less dark? Yes, but deliberately. The original ending would have been much more in line with a classic Twilight Zone-style twist. The family thinks they're escaping. Instead, they end up stranded somewhere else. There's no neat resolution, no magical restoration, and Greg remains dead. The theatrical ending is much more sentimental. It gives audiences closure. The family is reunited. Denise gets Greg back. And even Starbucks survives. That makes the movie more accessible as a mainstream science fiction adventure. SYFY specifically notes that Mitchell's original concept had a much more Twilight Zone-like quality, while the final version became considerably more upbeat. Was the change made because of test audiences? There's no solid evidence that a test audience forced the change. Some reviews speculated that the original ending may have been altered because it was too bleak. But the confirmed information points more directly to a creative decision by Mitchell and Abrams. They had faith in the revised ending. And Hathaway's comments indicate that the change happened close to the beginning of filming rather than after the movie had already been completed. So, it would be misleading to say the studio changed the ending because audiences hated it. That's not what has been confirmed. Instead, the filmmakers themselves decided to move toward a more hopeful conclusion. Why bring Greg back instead of keeping him dead? The biggest reason is probably the relationship between Denise and Greg. The movie spends considerable time establishing that their marriage is in trouble. If Greg dies permanently, Denise's emotional journey becomes a story about accepting loss. That's powerful. But the new ending gives her something more unusual. It gives her the opportunity to act on what she learned. She doesn't just grieve Greg. She goes back and changes the circumstances that caused his death. That makes the time travel element emotionally meaningful. The wormhole isn't just a science fiction gimmick. It's a second chance. Final answer. So, why did the end of Oak Street change its original ending? Because David Robert Mitchell and J.J. Abrams ultimately decided that the story worked better with a hopeful second chance for Denise and Greg. Originally, Greg's death was permanent. Denise and the children would travel through the wormhole, but instead of returning to 1982, they would end up farther back in time, during the settlers' era. They would survive, but Greg would remain dead, and the family would be stranded in the past. The revised ending completely changes that. Denise and the children return to 1982, shortly before Oak Street disappears. Denise realizes Greg is still alive. She warns people about the coming event and manages to keep Greg away from the neighborhood. That allows the Platt family to reunite. And Hathaway initially wasn't convinced that changing Greg's fate was the right decision because she had become invested in the original tragic ending. But after watching the finished movie with someone who had lost their father, she saw how emotionally powerful the new ending could be. The viewer's reaction convinced her that Mitchell and Abrams had made the right call. And that's ultimately why the ending changed. The original version was about surviving loss. The new version is about getting one impossible second chance. It also makes Denise's entire journey more emotionally satisfying. She begins the movie uncertain about her marriage. She loses Greg. She discovers how much he means to her. And then she gets the one thing nobody normally gets: a chance to go back and make a different choice. The original ending may have been darker and more mysterious, but the final ending gives the audience something much more emotional. Greg gets to come home. And for the end of Oak Street, that second chance ultimately became more important than the original tragedy.